Every Valentine's Day, I wake before the sun. I lie there in the quiet, just listening. The house breathes around me, wood settling, the stove ticking with last night's heat, and somewhere down the hall, small feet hitting the floor because Thomas has never learned to sleep past dawn. And every year, in that stillness, I go back. I go back to the snow, to the train, to the day I arrived in Kansas with nothing worth counting and found, well, I found everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. February of 1884, and the world had turned white. I mean, completely, terrifyingly white. The kind of white that swallows sound and direction and hope all at once. The train had been slowing for an hour. The engineer fighting drifts that piled across the tracks like God himself had decided nobody was going any further. And then just like that, we stopped. The wheels screamed against ice. The whole car shuddered. And then, silence. The worst kind of silence. The kind that tells you nobody's coming. I sat in the third car from the back, holding Thomas against my chest. He was 5 months old. 5 months of hungry nights and mended diapers and milk that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. He slept through the stopping, because babies don't know enough to be afraid. I envied him that. Around me, passengers stirred. A heavy-set man in a bowler hat pressed his face to the window and cursed. A woman 2 rows up began to cry soft, hiccuping sobs that reminded me of my sister back in Missouri. Someone called for the conductor. Someone else said we'd freeze before morning. I didn't move. My hands went still in my lap. My breathing slowed until it matched Thomas's that shallow, steady rhythm of a body that's decided panic isn't worth the cost. The woman 2 rows up wailed louder. I watched my own fingers, perfectly motionless on my son's back, and I thought, this is what you're good at, Hannah. Being still while the world falls apart. I'd had practice. The morning I woke to find Daniel's side of the bed cold. His boots gone from beside the door, no note on the table. No explanation. Just absence. I'd lain there for a full hour without moving. 7 months pregnant and abandoned between one heartbeat and the next. He just vanished. And the worst part, the part I never told anyone, was that there'd been good days. Days when he'd sing while chopping wood, when he'd press his hand against my belly and grin like a boy. That's what made the leaving so sharp. If he'd been nothing but cruel, the losing would have been simple. In my carpet bag, folded beneath my one spare dress, was the letter, Gideon McAllister. It said, Rancher, Kansas Territory, seeking a wife of good character and sound health. I'd answered that advertisement with hands that shook. Because what kind of woman sells herself to a stranger for a roof? I'll tell you what kind. The kind with a baby to feed and a landlord who'd given her till month's end. The wind hit the rail car sideways, and the whole thing rocked. Thomas stirred, made that small mewling sound that meant he'd be hungry soon. I pressed my lips to that soft, impossible spot on his head, where I could feel his pulse against my mouth. And I whispered the only prayer I had left. Let this man be kind. I can survive anything except cruelty. He came out of the blizzard like something that wasn't quite real. I'd been watching the window not because I expected anyone, but because watching was better than thinking when a shape materialized through the white, tall, broad across the shoulders, moving slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when every step costs him something, A horse behind him, head bowed against the wind, and the man leading it by the reins because riding would have been suicide in that visibility. My heart did something strange. Not hope I wasn't foolish enough for hope. More like recognition. The way an animal knows when something's coming, good or bad, and braces itself either way. He boarded the car in a gust of snow and frozen air. Ice clung to his eyebrows. His coat expensive. I noticed. Thick wool with a fur collar was crusted white. He was shaking. Not the small tremor of discomfort, but the deep, bone-level shaking of a man who'd been in killing cold too long. He looked down the car, snow melting off his hat brim, and said, "I'm looking for a Mrs. Bright." His voice was rough, tired, but not unkind. I stood. Thomas shifted against my shoulder, and I felt every eye in that rail car land on me, my mended dress, my worn boots, the baby clutched tight. I watched Gideon McAllister's gaze move from my face to my clothes to my son, and I waited. I knew that look. The quick arithmetic men do when reality don't match the picture they'd built in their heads. I braced for disappointment, for the slight tightening of the jaw, the polite mask sliding into place. It didn't come. Instead, he crossed the car in 3 long strides, unbuttoned his coat, that beautiful, expensive coat, and wrapped it around me and Thomas in one motion. Didn't ask, didn't hesitate, just gave it, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Ma'am," he said, "we gotta move. Storm's getting worse, and my horse ain't gonna last much longer." I should have said thank you, should have said something gracious and proper. Instead, I said, "You'll freeze without your coat." He looked at me, really looked, for the first time, and something flickered behind his eyes. "I reckon I'll manage." The ride back to his ranch took, I don't know, an hour. Time loses meaning when the world is nothing but white and wind and the sound of a horse fighting through drifts. I pressed Thomas between my body and the saddle horn, wrapped in that coat that smelled of cedar and cold leather, and Gideon walked beside us, one hand on the reins, coatless, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle working even through the snow. He didn't complain, not once. I held his coat tight around my son and told myself it meant nothing. A man who gives his coat to a stranger is either very kind or very foolish, and I couldn't yet tell which. Either way, I couldn't afford to be grateful. Gratitude is a debt, and I'd come to Kansas already owing more than I could repay. The ranch house was, well, it was something. I stood in the doorway, snow still melting off my shoulders, his shoulders, really, since I was drowning in that coat, and I just stared. Carved wood furniture, an imported rug, the kind with patterns I'd only seen in catalog pictures, a mantelpiece with a clock that probably cost more than my father earned in a year, china behind glass, curtains that matched the wallpaper, and all of it cold, cold as a church in January. Gideon led me through the front room with the stiff formality of a man who didn't know what to do with a woman in his house. "Spare rooms down the hall," he said. I had Mrs. Perkins from town come out and make it up last week." The spare room was clean, fine, even a real feather bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, but there was no cradle, no sign that anyone had thought about a baby at all. I looked at Thomas, then at the room, And I did what I'd been doing since the day Daniel left. I figured it out myself. I pulled out the bottom drawer of the dresser, lined it with the quilt from the bed, and laid Thomas down gentle. He looked up at me from that makeshift cradle, surrounded by mahogany and brass handles. And he smiled. 5 months old, and my son was already better at adapting than most grown men I'd known. Gideon appeared in the doorway, saw the drawer. His mouth opened, then closed. Something moved across his face. Shame. Maybe. Or the particular discomfort of a man realizing he'd failed at something he should have considered. He didn't say anything, just turned and walked toward the kitchen. I followed, because standing still has never been my way. The kitchen was the saddest room in the house. It had everything: good iron stove, copper pots, a pantry stocked deep enough to last a month. But there was dust on the flour bin, cobwebs in the corners of the window. The stove was cold, and through the frost-covered glass above the basin, I could see the remains of a kitchen garden dead stalks poking through the snow. Soil gone hard and untended. Whatever had once grown there, long since abandoned. When Gideon knelt to start the fire, his hands shook so bad from the ride that he couldn't strike the match. "Here," I said. Didn't ask. Just moved him aside gently, the way you'd move a child, and built that fire myself. 3 twists of newspaper, kindling stacked just so. The match struck on the first try. I had the kettle on and flour out before he'd even stood up from the floor. He watched me move through his kitchen like I'd been there my whole life, and I could feel him recalculating, rearranging whatever picture he'd had of the poor widow who'd answered his advertisement. You know your way around a kitchen," he said. "I know my way around surviving, Mr. McAllister." I didn't look at him when I said it, just kept working. Biscuits from flour and lard, because that's what there was. A kitchen's just where some of the surviving happens. That first night, he sat at his mahogany table, a table that could have seated 12, and ate my biscuits like a man who'd forgotten what fresh-baked anything tasted like. I sat across from him with Thomas on my lap, and the blizzard howled outside like it was trying to tear the world apart. The dust on the flour bin, the cobwebs, the dead garden frozen under snow. Every room full of fine things and empty of life. I spread butter across a biscuit and thought, "You're needed here. Hannah Bright. You, with your mended dress and your empty pockets. You're the thing this house has been missing." By the second day, we'd found a rhythm. It wasn't comfortable. Exactly more like 2 horses learning to pull the same wagon, bumping against each other's stride and pretending it didn't happen. But it worked. I cooked. He chopped wood. I tended Thomas. He hauled water from the pump before the pipes froze solid. We moved around each other in that big house, careful and deliberate, close enough to feel the pull, far enough to pretend we didn't. I learned things about Gideon McAllister in those days. Small things. The kind you only notice when you're trapped in a house with someone and there's nowhere to look but at them. He ate standing up. He'd sit when I put food on the table, but left to his own habits. He'd eat at the counter with his back to the room, like a man who'd forgotten that meals were meant to be shared. He sat too far from the fire, always pressed against the far wall of the sitting room, as if warmth were something he didn't deserve. And he watched Thomas. Lord, how he watched Thomas. Not the way some men watch babies that distant, vaguely alarmed look, like the child might explode. No, Gideon watched my son with hunger, with a kind of aching recognition, like Thomas reminded him of something he'd lost. His hands would drift toward the baby, hover there for a moment, fingers half curled and then pull back, like he'd caught himself reaching for something that wasn't his. On the second afternoon, he tried to help me with the broth. I'd found a ham bone in the pantry, some dried beans, an onion that was half past its best, but still usable. Gideon stood beside me at the stove, awkward as a schoolboy, and I handed him the spoon. "Just stir," I said. "Slow. Don't let it stick." He burned it within 10 minutes. I almost laughed. Almost. The richest man in the territory. And he couldn't keep a pot of broth from scorching. I ain't much use in a kitchen," he said, and his ears went red in a way that made him look about 15 years old. "I noticed," I said, and this time I did smile. Just a little. Just enough. By the third evening, something had shifted. Not anything I could name, more like the air between us had changed temperature. Warmer by half a degree. Thomas was fussy that night, the way babies get when the air pressure changes, and I walked him up and down the hallway past midnight singing Shenandoah in the low, soft voice my mother used to use. I wasn't singing for anyone but my son. I wasn't thinking about anything but his small weight in my arms and the way his breathing slowed when I hit the low notes. But I heard the footsteps. Gideon, in the hallway, just stopped. I could feel him there standing in the dark, listening, not moving closer, not walking away, just holding still, like a man who'd stumbled onto something sacred and was afraid that any movement would break it. I kept singing, and I thought, with a sadness that surprised me, he had all this space and no one to fill it. I had nothing and a heart too full. Somewhere between us lay something that almost balanced. He didn't come in, but he didn't walk away either. And when I finally laid Thomas down and stepped into the hall, it was empty, but the air was warmer there, like someone had been standing in it for a long, long time. Day 4, and the blizzard decided it wasn't finished with us. The wind shifted sometime around noon, swung hard from the north, and hit the house like a fist. I was feeding Thomas when I heard the crack. Sharp, sudden, like a rifle shot. Then cold air, instant, vicious cold pouring into the sitting room where the front window had split clean down the middle. Gideon was there in seconds. He grabbed boards from the porch rail, nails from a tin in the pantry, and hammered that window shut while snow blew sideways into the room. I held Thomas in the doorway and watched him work his jaw set, his hands moving fast despite the cold, his whole body braced against the wind like he was holding back the storm itself. When he finished, he sat down hard by the fire. Snow melted off his sleeves, pooling on the floor. His hands were shaking not just from cold this time, but from something deeper. Exhaustion. Maybe. Or the slow erosion of pretending everything was fine. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, stared at the fire, and then, I don't know why, maybe because the storm had stripped away everything but honesty, he started talking. "Her name was Catherine," he said. Quiet, like the words had weight. She used to keep violets on that windowsill, little clay pot she'd brought from her mother's house. After the fever took her, I couldn't look at that pot. So I bought the clock, put it where the violets were. Then I bought the rug And the china, and he trailed off. Like if I filled the rooms, they wouldn't be so empty. He looked at me then, and his eyes were the saddest things I'd ever seen on a living man. That dog won't hunt, he said softly. Turns out empty is empty, no matter how much you put in it. I sat down across from him. Thomas was quiet in my arms, watching the firelight like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. And because Gideon had offered truth, I owed him the same. My husband didn't die, I said. The words came out steadier than I expected. He left, just walked out one morning before Thomas was born. No note, no explanation. I woke up and his boots were gone, and that was... I stopped, took a breath. Death is kinder, I think. At least it isn't a choice. Gideon looked at me. That ain't true. What he done that ain't about your worth. Maybe, I said. But it felt true. Still does. Some days. The fire crackled between us. Outside, the wind screamed, and inside, something shifted, something I don't have words for. Even now, it was like we'd both been carrying these heavy, terrible things alone for so long that setting them down in front of each other felt like breathing after being underwater. He didn't try to fix me, didn't offer comfort or wisdom or any of those useless phrases people say when they don't know what else to give. He just sat there with me in the honest wreckage of two broken lives and let the silence be enough. Then Thomas fussed, and Gideon slowly, carefully, like he was handling something made of glass, reached toward my son. His hands hovered. He looked at me. I nodded. He picked Thomas up, awkwardly, the way men do when they're terrified of breaking something small. Thomas squirmed for a moment, then settled against Gideon's broad chest, one tiny hand curling around the collar of his shirt. I watched my son's fist grip that fabric, and something cracked open inside me that I'd boarded up as thoroughly as Gideon had boarded that window. I turned my face toward the fire so he wouldn't see what was happening in my eyes. Day 5, and the cold came for us in earnest. I woke before dawn, knowing something was wrong. The house was quiet in that particular way that means the fire's gone too low. And when I pressed my hand to the wall beside my bed, the wood was ice, not cold ice. The kind of cold that seeps through logs and plaster and everything men build to keep the wilderness out. Gideon was already in the kitchen, staring at the wood box. Empty. He'd been rationing since day 3, and we'd burned through every last stick. There's a store in the barn, he said. His voice was calm, but I could see the calculation in his eyes, the distance, the wind, the temperature. Enough to last us another week if I can get to it. You can't go out in this. I said it flat, not asking, telling. Ain't got a choice. Hannah. It was the first time he'd used my Christian name. I wish I could say I noticed it in the moment, but I was too busy being terrified because the barn was 50 yards from the house, and 50 yards in that blizzard might as well have been 50 miles. He went. I stood at the door with Thomas on my hip, and I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. I counted his footsteps until the sound disappeared into the wind. Then I counted seconds, then minutes, and the whole time, this voice in my head, the same voice that had narrated every terrible morning since Daniel left, whispered, "He's not coming back. They never come back. You should know that by now." 7 minutes. That's how long he was gone. 7 minutes that lasted approximately forever. The door burst open and Gideon fell inside, literally fell, dropping an armload of split wood across the floor. His face was white. Not pale white, like the blood had given up trying. His gloves were frozen to his hands, and when I pulled them off, the skin underneath was gray and waxy in patches that made my stomach drop. "Sit down," I said. "No," I commanded. There was no room for his pride or mine. "Sit down and don't you move." I worked fast. Blankets first, everyone I could find. Piled around him until only his face showed. Then hot water, heated on the stove that still had enough ember to catch new flame. I took his hands between mine and held them there, skin to skin, because body heat transfers faster than anything else. And I knew this. I knew this because I'd spent 2 winters in a cabin with no money for enough firewood. And you learn things about cold when it's the enemy you fight every single day. "Hannah." I pressed his fingers between my palms, rubbing slow, steady. "You don't get to talk right now. You just get to sit there and let me do this." He hushed, and in the quiet, with the fire slowly building and his frozen hands thawing between mine, I felt something settle inside me. Something I'd been too afraid to name. His hands came back to color slow pink, creeping into gray. His fingers curling around mine as the feeling returned. He looked up at me, and I saw it in his face. Not gratitude, exactly. Recognition. Like he was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. You done this before?" he said. "Mr. McAllister," I said, and I almost smiled. "I've been doing this my whole life." That night, I couldn't sleep. Gideon had recovered shaky and chastened, but warm, breathing steady by the fire where I'd made him stay. Thomas slept in his drawer cradle, perfect and oblivious. The storm still raged outside, but it sounded tired now, like even the blizzard was running out of fury. I sat in the dark kitchen with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, and I was afraid. Not of the storm. I'd stopped being afraid of weather the day Daniel left, and I realized that nature is honest in its cruelty. It doesn't pretend to love you first. No, I was afraid of something much worse. I was afraid of the morning. Because listen, the blizzard had done something I hadn't expected. It had erased everything. His wealth, my poverty, the contract between us, the power and the obligation, and the careful transaction of a mail-order marriage all buried under snow. In this house, during this storm. I wasn't the poor bride, and he wasn't the rich rancher. I was just Hannah, and he was just Gideon, and we were just 2 people who'd found each other in the cold. But storms end. They always end. And when this one broke, the real world would come flooding back. His neighbors would visit. The town would see me my mended dress, my empty carpet bag, the baby I'd brought like baggage. They'd do the same arithmetic Gideon hadn't done on the train, and they'd find me wanting And Gideon, would he see it too? I traced a crack in the coffee cup with my thumbnail, around and around the same circle. Once the crisis passed and his fine furniture mattered again. Once there were people around to notice the gap between us. Would he look at me the way Daniel had? Not with cruelty, but with that slow, quiet recalculation. This is not what I imagined. I thought about the easy version, the safe one. Marry him like we planned. Cook, clean, raise Thomas under a solid roof. Keep my heart locked up tight and never, ever let him see the parts of me that wanted more than shelter. I knew how to do that. I'd been doing that for 2 years, living behind walls, surviving inside a life that was functional, bloodless, safe. But then I thought about Catherine's violets, about a man who bought a clock to cover the place where flowers used to be, about the way he'd stood in the dark hallway listening to me sing, not moving closer, not walking away, about my son's fist gripping his collar like it belonged there. I could survive being left again. I'd done it before, and I'd do it again if I had to, because that's what survivors do. But I wasn't sure, honestly. Truly wasn't sure I could survive choosing to stay and being wrong. Choosing to open my heart in this man's house and finding out, one ordinary morning, that what we'd shared was just closeness. Just 2 cold people standing near a fire and calling it something it wasn't. Somewhere before dawn, sitting in that dark kitchen with the fire dying and my son sleeping and a good man breathing in the next room, I stopped asking whether Gideon would leave. I started asking whether I was brave enough to stay, really stay. Not just stand in his house wearing his ring, but stay with my whole stubborn, frightened, still beating heart. I woke to silence. That was the first thing, silence. After 5 days of wind so constant, it had become the texture of the world. The absence of it was almost violent. I lay in bed, blinking, and for a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. Then Thomas made a small sound in his drawer cradle, and I heard it crystal clear every gurgle, every breath, and I realized it wasn't my ears. The storm had stopped. I picked up my son and walked to the front room. The window Gideon had boarded up let no light through, but the kitchen window. Oh, the kitchen window was a revelation. Sunlight, actual, honest, blinding sunlight poured through the frosted glass like God had opened a door. And outside, the world was white and gold and impossibly still. Snow banked up to the windowsills, icicles hanging from the eaves like crystal, and above it all, a sky so blue it didn't look real. February 14th, Valentine's Day. And the Kansas territory had never looked more beautiful or more terrifying. Because the storm was over, and that meant the world was about to come back. I stood at that window with Thomas in my arms, watching the light move across the snow, and I felt every wall I'd spent the night building start to rise. I could feel it happening, the armor sliding into place, the careful distance reassembling. Mrs. Bright, the mail-order bride, grateful, polite, appropriate, safe. I heard Gideon behind me before I saw him, His footsteps on the kitchen floor. Slow, careful, like a man approaching something that might startle. He came and stood beside me at the window. Not too close. Just there. We looked at the world together. All that white, all that quiet. "Well," he said. His voice was rough with sleep and something else. "Reckon we've already been through the hard part." Simple words, plain as dirt. But I heard what was underneath them. The question he was really asking, was this real? Or was it just the storm? I stood there with sunlight on my face and my son in my arms and this good, sad, clumsy man beside me. And I felt the walls shudder. The ones I was building, they shuddered. And I thought about the fire I'd built in his cold kitchen, the broth I'd made, the lullabies I'd sung into empty rooms, the way I'd held his frozen hands between mine and brought him back to life with nothing but warmth. My warmth, given freely, not because I owed it, but because, and this was the terrifying part, because I wanted to. I thought about the easy road. Nod politely. Say, "Yes, sir." Let the transaction resume. Button up my heart and be the wife he'd ordered from a letter presentable. Functional, closed as a fist. And then I thought, no, I am the woman who kept this house alive for 5 days. I am done pretending that doesn't matter. So I smiled at Gideon McAllister. Not the practiced smile I'd prepared for a stranger, the real one. The crooked one. The one I hadn't used since before Thomas was born. And I said, "Reckon we have." 3 words. 3 small words. And my voice. It almost broke on them. Because in that echo, I wasn't agreeing to an arrangement. I was choosing a partnership. I was saying, "I see you. You see me. What we built in this storm is worth more than what was written in any letter." I picked up Thomas, shifted him to my hip, and stood beside Gideon at that sun-filled window. Not behind him, beside him. I came to Kansas to survive. Standing there in that golden light with my son in my arms, and this man next to me, this man who'd given his coat to a stranger and couldn't boil broth and listened to lullabies in the dark like they were hymns. I realized I'd stopped surviving. I'd started choosing. That was 40 years ago. I tell this story sometimes. When February comes around and the frost paints the windows, and Thomas, who is taller than his father ever was, with Gideon's steady hands and my stubborn mouth brings his own children to visit, I tell it while I pour coffee into 2 cups. Same as every morning. Same 2 cups. Gideon's is the blue one with the chip on the handle. He won't let me replace it. People in town, they have their version. The poor widow who married the rich rancher. They say Gideon McAllister gave me everything: his name, his house, his land, and I smile when I hear it, because people see what makes sense to them, and a woman rescued by a wealthy man. Well, that's a story folks understand. But that ain't what happened. That ain't even close. What happened was a blizzard. 5 days of white blind, bone freezing, world-erasing winter. And in those 5 days, every lie we tell about rich and poor got stripped away like paint in a storm. And what was left was just 2 people, 2 lonely, broken, scared people who'd both lost someone and were both pretending they hadn't. Gideon learned to hold Thomas properly by the end of that first week. Not the stiff, terrified grip of a man afraid of breaking something, but the easy, one-armed carry of a father who's done it 1,000 times. He built a cradle with his own hands that spring, not bought, built, sanded the wood smooth with his own palms, and carved Thomas's name into the headboard in letters so careful you'd think he was writing scripture. And I planted a kitchen garden, cleared out those dead stalks I'd seen through the window that first night, turned the hard soil, put in tomatoes, beans, herbs, squash. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Something I'd put into the ground and tended and grown. And when the first tomato ripened in July, I stood in that garden with dirt under my fingernails and sun on my face, and I felt rich. Not because of Gideon's money. Lord knows we argued about money plenty over the years, but because I'd planted something in soil that was partly mine, and it had grown. The town whispered. Of course, they always do. Poor bride, mail-order wife, married him for his ranch. I'd survived whispers before. They bounce off you after a while, like rain off oilcloth. And Gideon, he'd learned something during that blizzard that his money never taught him. A warm house matters more than a fine one. A woman who can build a fire in a crisis is worth more than all the imported rugs in the territory. We had our hard times. I won't pretend otherwise. There were droughts and difficult winters, and a year when the cattle prices dropped so low, Gideon sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and I sat beside him and said, "We've been through worse. Remember the blizzard?" And he laughed this tired, broken, beautiful laugh and said, "Reckon we have." That became our phrase, our shorthand for everything. When Thomas broke his arm falling from the barn loft, reckon we've been through worse. When the creek flooded the south pasture, reckon we have. When Gideon's hair went silver and my hands got lined, and we looked at each other across that same mahogany table, 40 years older and still sitting in the same chairs. Reckon we have. Every Valentine's Day. I wake before the sun. I lie in the dark and listen to Gideon breathing beside me. And I go back to that train. That stopped. Stranded. Snowblind train. I go back to the woman I was mended dress. Empty pockets. A baby on her hip and terror in her heart. And I wish I could tell her. I wish I could reach back through all those years and take her cold hands and say, "You are not poor, Hannah Bright. You never were. You carry fire inside you. And one day, a man in a blizzard is going to need exactly the warmth you have to give." But I couldn't tell her then. She had to learn it herself. In the snow, in the cold, in the 5 longest days of her life, when a rich man's fancy furniture meant nothing and a poor woman's lullaby meant everything. People say Gideon McAllister gave me everything. I smile when I hear it, because what I remember is a man with no coat, shaking in the snow, who had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. Until I built a fire and sang a lullaby and showed him what warmth really was. Until I held his frozen hands and brought him back. Until I stood beside him in the Valentine's sun and said 3 small words that weren't about surviving anymore. They were about choosing. And I chose well. Hannah McAllister, née Bright, Kansas Territory, 1884.